thanks to ODI for the invitation and the Asian Development Bank for the presentation. And I think it's good to see the Asian Development Bank reiterating the need for considering the equality and inclusiveness of growth. And I say reiterating because from the perspective of the development community, we've been here before. In fact, we seem to have been here for about 30 years and never actually moved. The labels may have changed and things like that. So, but it's good to bring it, to keep it on the agenda and maybe emphasize it more. And one issue is that fiscal policy can shape the inclusiveness of growth, but more often it's always been reactive. And a broad generalization is that in countries where if they think times are good, then you'll often observe a more redistributive, a more equitable orientation in policies. But as soon as there's a perception that, well, times may not be so good, you often see a retrenchment, and often quite a severe retrenchment that's politically very difficult and that actually exacerbates divisions. So, one important issue is, certainly from the developing Asia perspective, is, well, are times, do they feel times are good? Is this a good time to again try to emphasize this on the agenda? And I'm not so sure, but I think that's an issue you have to think about, because ultimately it's a political decision. Economics can provide some guidance, but it is very much a political decision as to what governments are willing and able to do. Before some other comments, I think two issues, the relationship between the declines in poverty, where you would say that seems to be very good, and the increases in inequality is certainly something that deserves more investigation. Because at a minimum, observing those trends is consistent with two things. There may be others, but two which strike me is, first of all, it seems quite likely that a lot of the poverty reduction is really only moving the poor a little bit above the poverty line. And if that's the case, we would expect that, well, actually, they're all very vulnerable. So these achievements could be quite precarious. And that's one issue to keep in mind. So don't get too happy. Congratulate yourselves, but kind of say, well, more needs to be done. And a second and related issue, which I will come back to, is I think a feature of it is low-wage employment. And particularly in developing countries quite generally, and Asian countries are probably the best example, when they tried to have manufacturing, and especially manufacturing export supported growth, then to maintain competitiveness, it was usually on labor costs. And you even see labor's share of value adding diminishing. And I think that's a big problem. And largely it's a big problem because that means that the tax base is not growing. And I'll come back to that issue. Although economists, or as an economist, I don't think we can say, you can't say that there is an optimal or a particular ideal level of inequality or level of redistribution. It is a political decision, but there are some guidelines from experience. And one is, the more comprehensive and the more generous any kind of welfare or social protection system is, the more expensive it is. And if you're planning now, you should keep in mind what the future cost of these proposals will be. Otherwise, they won't be sustainable. There's also, I would argue, both politically and equitably, in terms of equity, it's far more difficult to reduce kind of welfare or social protection scheme that's in place than it is not to increase what you're doing. So it encourages a more cautious approach, but alternative. Well, in addition, I would think you probably need to have sustainable revenue in place first before you start making grand commitments about extending social protection. I think that has implications for perhaps how one might go about it. Nevertheless, it is generally true that as the level of spending increases, it becomes more pro-poor in some broad sense. Generally, as the level of government spending increases, the share allocated to kind of social sector spending increases, and even if the incidence of that spending is not in itself progressive, there will be more benefits to poorer. And there's a lot of evidence for that. And I think another context one I would make is progressivity in taxes is to some extent good or desirable if you think equity is important, but it's not the same thing as imagining that there's a lot of revenue to be got out of, you know, taxes on inheritance or property or the very rich. Because one thing we all know is they're very hard to tax. They're in the best position possible to avoid or evade any attempts to capture them, both politically and financially. And often, even if you do try to catch them, it can be good in equity terms, it can be a good signal, but often it doesn't generate large amounts of revenue. So those taxes won't generate a big increase in revenue to finance social spending. And I think another qualification of that is, you know, the market or private provision is not that good at delivering public goods if equity is what you're concerned about. They might be well able to deliver services, but they're not necessarily the best way to do it in an equitable way. And that's important if your focus is on health and education. So I think 2 comments on taxation and then 2 comments, I suppose, on the expenditure side. On the taxation side, it seems to me that the big problem in many developing countries, now my perspective or my expertise, to the extent that I have any, is more on African countries than on Asian countries. And although the Asian countries are more developed, higher incomes, more diversified, in fiscal terms and kind of public expenditure shares and patterns, they're actually a bit more like Africa than they are like Latin America, which is an interesting observation. And part of that, seems to me, must reflect somewhere along the line more or less a political choice for low taxation. And they may well have made that choice. Well, who knows why they made that choice, but they do seem to have made that choice. And that would lead you to think, well, where are they going to increase taxation? And I think, as you suggested, the only viable way to do it, if you want to, because if you want to significantly increase social sector spending, you're also looking for a significant increase in tax GDP ratios, say of about 5 percentage points or more. And the only real way to do that is broad-based taxation. But then that comes back to the issue, well, who or what is this broad base that you're going to tax? Now, typically you think, well, it's incomes. Now, you either tax them as incomes, or you tax them when people spend, or, as in advanced countries, you do both. In fact, most countries, to some extent, do both, and you have to. But if what's underlying a lot of the growth in these countries is low wage employment. And if, as you know, when you look at, say, the most recent World Development Report, the World Bank is kind of saying that the big problem is employment. How do we generate employment? And it's not, they focus more on jobs. But I would say, well, actually, that's only one part of the problem. The big problem is how do you generate employment at a proper wage? In other words, employment that generates an increase in the tax base. And I don't see very many simple solutions to that, which means that you should be very cautious about what's feasible. A brief comment on resources, which are important in some countries. And what we all know is that the big problem about resources is let's just say there's a lack of transparency in how revenues are captured and used. But there's a strong argument could be made that, well, actually, that is a source of revenue which you should try to earmark in some sense. And rather than letting it be wasted, as happens in many countries, you just think of, okay, how can this generate a fund that can be used to deliver these types of social justice objectives? So maybe one strategy there would be earmarking. So on tax, I've just two comments. You have to think about how do you solve increasing the tax base so that you can generate revenue without increasing tax rates. And where it's relevant in those countries, you have to work out how to transparently use the revenue from resources. And certainly Papua New Guinea is a prime example of that. My understanding there is they had some very good suggestions for a transparent use, but politically, maybe we don't want to do that. And then on the kind of spending side, most of the focus in the presentation was kind of on health and education, and I think that's important, that has to be focused on. But it's worth also thinking of the other side, which is kind of what Francesca was raising, is the more social welfare, social protection sides of spending. And it's probably not sensible to, or it may not be sensible to aspire to the kind of European type model where you have a very expensive, wide-based pensions and unemployment and social protection schemes. That may not be the most feasible option. Perhaps a more feasible option is to think more about conditional cash transfers. Certainly in Latin America, there are cases where conditional cash transfers can be quite effective. Some who would argue that they don't even need to be conditional. Well, I'm not so convinced about that. But one advantage of that type of approach is that it may be easier to plan what type of revenue can you generate and what type of scheme would that finance, and what coverage can that have and how can it be delivered. So that would be my suggestion on spending, that maybe think about that instrument as being politically and in terms of budget finance the most viable. Thank you.
Thank you, Oliver, for bringing in also the wider literature on this issue, and also you started out. So what is new in the report? So we'll definitely come back to to that in terms of questions, and also the importance of raising tax base, raising the tax base, and then the question is how can it be done? Can it be done quickly? And maybe that's also something that Gareth, our final discussant, could pick up. Over to you.